To give you a sense, I've been working in technology mostly, education somewhat, for over 40 years now. I have seen and participated in a number of different big changes in technology. I created one of the very first two-factor authentication devices. I created one of the very first consumer VR system. I created the platform that did 3D on the web and is the grandfather of all 3D on the web today, and I'm doing a lot of work now in artificial intelligence. So I've been sort of trying to keep track with the current trends. And I'm not actually going to probably talk about technology for the next 20 minutes because technology, as it turns out, isn't really what's changing the most right now. What's changing the most right now is us. And if we want to take a look at the changing shape of business, we're going to set the focus squarely on us. So let's start at the end of the story. The end of the story happens on the 25th of March in 2020. Prime Minister comes onto the television set and tells everyone in Australia to go home and stay there. Now, we kind of knew it was coming because we could see it happening in nation after nation. But in some ways, maybe we didn't really think about what it would mean. But Australians are very compliant, and we're also very scared of dying of the coronavirus. And so pretty much immediately, all of Australia looked like a vast abandoned wasteland. It was a very odd moment because we were all at home watching TV and basically wondering if we were witnessing the end of the world. I think at some level, yes, we were very worried about whether the coronavirus was going to kill everyone, but we were also very worried about the fact that it seemed as though the entirety of civilization had suddenly come to a screeching stop. That the pandemic didn't just stop a city like Sydney or Melbourne. It didn't just stop a state. It didn't just stop a nation. It stopped the entire planet. This not only was unprecedented, it hadn't even entered into the thinking or planning for anyone who had been doing any planning whatsoever around preparations for a pandemic. And there'd been a lot of that because, we thought there might be a bird flu at some point. So there'd been some planning around what to do in a pandemic. But no one had really considered what would happen if you sent everyone home to prevent a pandemic spreading. What happened was that the entire planet basically stopped working. And so everyone's sitting at home going, okay, how am I going to pay my bills? How am I going to pay for the heating and the food and the electricity and the mortgage? How is my business going to continue to run? We watched the TV and watched the crisis unfold and basically wondered what was going to happen next because we were all clearly in uncharted waters. Now, there's one group of people who weren't at home, who were thinking very deeply about what was going to happen next, and that was pretty much everyone involved at every level of government, going, okay, how do we prevent the economy from diving over a cliff so that it's never seen again? And of course, the answer, governments worldwide just started up the money printers and printed in Australia somewhere around $180 billion in about 6 months, got pumped into the economy to keep things ticking over. And this is pretty much commensurate with what happened in other nations all around the world. So the governments had a response, which was to start printing money. Printing money allows you to buy things, but it doesn't mean that business operates. And this is the thing that was really starting to concern people because we'd never really pulled the plug on all sorts of businesses before. And if you think about how business was in February of 2020, for most people what it meant was getting up, commuting to the office, going to the office and working for 8 hours, going home on a commute and going to bed. And you did that 5 days a week. And that pattern had been established over 100 years ago, basically by the end of the First World War. That pattern of working across all of industrial civilization everywhere in the world had been well established. And all of a sudden, that pattern disappeared. Now, when we say that that pattern disappeared, doesn't mean that it didn't try to sort of come back in other ways. Because yes, we were all at home. And maybe we started getting a few work emails. Hey, could you do this? Could you do that? And maybe we got an invite to this thing called video conferencing. And almost everyone who left an office had access to some sort of laptop, and that laptop had some sort of webcam built into it, and probably, if it was an office laptop, had some sort of software on it, just like Zoom that we're using here, to be able to do a video conference. Now, people had occasionally maybe done video conferences before this, but they hadn't really done many of them. But the interesting thing is, the decade before the pandemic, all of the technical infrastructure for massive, wide-scale video conferencing had been installed. It's just that no one used it because no one had a need for it. Well, within, say, 2 to 3 weeks after the lockdowns began, work transitioned from office to Zoom. It transitioned to now video conferencing and working at home. And that was unpredicted. It was unplanned for. Of course, it was kind of handled poorly at the beginning. We know that the phrase of the year of 2020 was "you're on mute," because so many people were experiencing these things for the first time and learning their way around all of these systems. The thing to really note here is that all of this happened everywhere in the world pretty much at the same time, pretty much in the same way, because we had computers, we had broadband, we had webcams, we had global computing infrastructure. All of the pieces needed to make this entirely new way of working work for us were in place. Now, when we talk about ways of working, again, I want to reflect on the fact that from about 1920 to around 2019, so that's a solid 100 years there, a certain style of work had been established. People come to a place of work, they work together, and then they disperse. And they do that 5 days a week, morning to night, morning to night. That was a heartbeat, and that heartbeat controlled the entirety of industrial civilization. And it really didn't matter whether you were making cars or making a bank. Everything was working along exactly those lines. No one questioned the logic of that. No one questioned the reality of it. It's just the way things were until they all went away. When they all went away, people immediately started to discover new ways of working. And when you don't have the boss looking over you to make sure you're staying on task or whatever it might be, you start to think quite differently about the ways that you want to work. One of the things that very quickly rose to the fore was an emphasis on outcomes over output. That in fact, outcomes are the important thing in any work task. Output maybe is part of outcomes, but really it's about reaching the outcomes that have been agreed. And this change in focus underlined a much larger change that had been happening to work since the lockdowns began. And here's the thing, and if you remember nothing else out of this talk, what I'm about to tell you is the key thing. We managed a complete transition in how we work, and we did it in less than a month, and the economy globally barely skipped a beat. Sometimes I feel like I'm the only person who ever noticed this, because I know that I'm the only futurist who talks about it. But it's actually, and I mean this sincerely, the most important fact of business that any of us will ever experience in our lifetimes. Because every support for how we work for the last 100 years was suddenly and catastrophically removed, and yet business more or less continued exactly as it did before. I mean, roll that around in your head for a minute, because it seems inconceivable that so much change could happen so quickly, and yet the output remained consistent. But that's exactly what happened. And what I want to do is sort of unroll that a little bit, because that's the key to why business is so different today. All right. So what we did on the 25th of March, 2020, is take a leap into the abyss. And everyone who took that leap was absolutely convinced that we were going to hit the ground at speed, and that would be that. Funny thing happened on the way down is we discovered we had a pair of wings, and that actually we could probably use them. And long before we got anywhere near the ground, we were flying around and doing loop-de-loops. That's effectively what happened because of the pandemic. Every business and every worker in every business had a whole set of capabilities that they'd never needed before, but as soon as they needed them, they were immediately available pervasively throughout the entire industrialized world. This is what I'm saying. It's like, this is a big deal, people. This is actually a huge thing, and somehow we just tend to sort of gloss it a little bit. But this is what happened. We leapt into the abyss and we never hit the ground. Now, that doesn't mean nothing hit the ground. Something did hit the ground. All of our ideas about what work is, how work should be done, where it should be performed and when, all of that hit the ground at speed and smashed into bits. That's the important thing we need to remember from this. So the idea of work being connected to a place of work, the idea of work being connected to a time of work, these were absolutely concrete. They were embedded in all of the style of all of the ways that we work. Those connections have snapped. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no connection between work and place. It doesn't mean that there's no connection between work and time. What it means is that those connections are only made when necessary. They are not built into any of our assumptions of how we work. And this is the key thing for understanding how business has transformed in the mid-21st century. And if you don't have that idea of work as being place, if you don't have that idea of work as being time, what do you have? You have work as a set of relationships. That's actually what work is. It's a set of relationships between people. And it's weird that we had to strip everything else away before we could see this clearly. But this, it turns out, is actually one of the big boons of the pandemic, that it stripped away everything we thought was business and took it to its core. So business is a sole trader working with their clients. It's a partnership working together. It's a family business. I could say a lot about family businesses, but that's another talk. It's a small design team working together on a consulting gig. It's a department in a big organization working together, and it's the big organization. It's all of these different scales. It's all of these different relationships. And of course, this is one reason why we emphasize getting along, strong relationships within an organization. This is one reason why we have a lot less tolerance for bullying in organizations than we used to, because we've started to understand that the organization exists as a series of relationships. And this is where the change in focus has been biggest. Now, it is interesting watching business as usual try to digest what has already happened. There is a lot of work here. There are a lot of people running around with sticky tape trying to stick Humpty Dumpty back together again. But Humpty Dumpty is smashed into pieces in the bottom of the abyss. But we see all of this just kind of back and forth about, oh my God, 4-day work. Oh my God, what's going to happen? Oh my God. We have the Premier of Victoria building her next election campaign on the guarantee of 3 days work in the office, 2 days home work, guaranteeing that to every worker. And they're doing that because they're functioning in a very different milieu, the post-pandemic milieu of how business works, as opposed to businesses which are trying to hold on to a model which worked well for 100 years, but snapped and broke and can't work that way again. So where we are now is encapsulated by one word that we started hearing around the time of the pandemic, maybe a little bit more, but we hear all the time now: hybrid. So work is both here and there. It's now and then. It's alone and together. It's flexible, it's evolving. And the most important element here, particularly when we're thinking about the shape of business in the middle of the 21st century, is it's negotiated. That, in fact, everything that teams do when they're working together, that relationships, particularly in the transactional context of business, relationships are the outcomes of successful negotiations. Now, there's something important to note here. Most people in businesses, whether they're managers or employees, don't have strong negotiation skills because they've never been taught them. And this is an area where businesses that will be flying high in the mid-21st century will excel. They will be good at negotiating internally, within teams, within departments, and externally with customers and vendors. They will see negotiation as core to the relationship building that they build their business on. However, we have to admit the reality of the present moment. There is not a lot of support for hybridity. We have some policies around this and some capabilities here, but there's no institutional support broadly, although we're starting to see some regulatory support here. There's very little process support here. How do you do things the right way to ensure that you can embed that relational hybridity into your organization? And is there any tool support? Well, other than video conferencing, no, there really isn't very much. This is still very new. It is still very raw, and there's still very little support. Now, the upside of this is that all of us building mid-21st century businesses can have a crack at creating the institutions, the processes, and the tools that can support us in these new ways of working. So this is a time of incredible potential and incredible creativity, because in this, we actually start to see the shape of how business is going to be setting the stage for its future growth. It's how it creates these institutions, how it creates these processes, and how it creates and uses these tools. And all of those, by the way, are also business opportunities in the mid-21st century. And I need to emphasize, there is no going back. The kinds of businesses that operated at scale, whether that was large scale or small scale, in 2019 are only operating that way in 2025 because of inertia, because this is the way that has always worked. This is the way that has always been done, so we are not going to change that because it has always worked for us. Now, there's a problem in that, and it's a big problem, and it's a problem that has manifested itself in the national consciousness like nothing I've ever seen. And the problem is productivity. Because, in fact, the difference between business as usual circa 2019 and the new business, where we've rethought work and where we've actually accepted the lesson of the pandemic that separates work from space and work from time and allows us to focus on work as relationality, that is the difference between an organization that is barely gaining in productivity year after year, and an organization that is constantly gaining the full scope of its productive potential every single year. We just had the productivity summit last week, and there was a lot of clucking and head shaking and this and thatting about all of the stuff that we could do and all the stuff the government could do. And sure, technology will help. There's no question about that. But the biggest drop in technology, the biggest block to a technology is between our ears, because the way we're thinking about what work is no longer what we know from our experience about how work now works. So my advice to you is as you're designing your businesses, get out of the business as usual. Throw that sheet of paper away. Go into the growth zone, which is focusing on the relational natures that you're growing at the core of your business. How can you make your business a set of strong relationships that allows every element in that business to be as free as they can be and as productive as they can be to the whole? How can we do that? How can we do that as a business? How can we do that as a culture? How can we do that as an economy? I think these are the keys to Australian success in the 21st century. And the thing is, Australia has an inside track here because we were locked down longer than any other nation in the world. So we embedded these learnings at a visceral level, far more than the Americans did, far more than the Europeans did. So we actually have a capability that we've learned that can be translated into institutional practices, processes, and tools. So I want you to now think, as you're going out, thinking about 21st century business, that you have just a clear sheet of paper that you can write on. You can design your business completely uniquely, knowing the new capabilities that we have. You can design it to be bespoke. Bespoke processes around bespoke relationships that you're emphasizing and you're leaning into. And that creates an organization that is profoundly human. Now, here's the thing. One last point. We do talk about the loss of productivity when people are working from home. And although that hasn't been seen, people believe it. The truth of the matter, of course, is everyone knows who works from home is very different. In fact, people are far more productive than they were working 5 days in the office. It's just that productivity isn't going all into the office. It's going into our lives now. We've crafted a culture post-pandemic where we're far more productive, but that productivity is going into care. Care for young people, care for old people, care for ourselves, care for our communities. We've figured out how to change the balance here. Now what we need to do is take a look at that. What did we do? How can we do that better? How can we also then bring that into our work practices? How can we make our business practices flexible enough that we can do that together? If we hit those notes, then we get to a new kind of business, a both-and business that will be better for everyone. Thank you.